Hey, everybody. It's Saturday after Thanksgiving. Hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving and you're enjoying your weekend. If you're around watching this, feel free to jump into the chat and I will do my best to pay attention to that and say hello if I see you. Okay, so today this is going to be long, probably. I don't know. Bear with me. But I think it'll be fun. And what I want to do eventually, so I'm going to work my way up to it, but I really want to talk about sort of the how and the why of the INFJ. So, how do you sort of think about them and why, and it all ties to the cognitive functions and personality type and all that. But I want to give a little bit of background of where I'm coming from so that when I get to that point, it will hopefully make sense. Okay. And so, and this first part is just pure speculation on my part. Okay. This is just my little functional theory of the way that I think psychological types or personality types work, why they exist in the first place. And, just sort of how to get a general understanding of them from sort of an evolutionary or a cultural design perspective, because I think it'll help a lot, no matter what type you are, sort of understanding your type and understanding other people's types. And so when you're interacting with them, you sort of know where they're coming from. And that's kind of the whole point of all this, right? So this, to me, I think gives me a good framework of how I think of the different types and why they are the way that they are. And again, pure speculation on my part. This is all just sort of made up theory time, but I hope it makes sense and you can somehow get some use out of it. Okay, so the first question is, why are there different personality types? Like, why isn't everybody just born the same, with the same personality type and sort of the same cognitive functions working in the same way? Is this purely just sort of random? And it just so happened to sort of end up this way? And it's hard for me to assume that it's just purely random, because you see the different psychological types in all different cultures, right? And if it's sort of arising independently in all the different cultures, you got to assume there's something there, right? That, like, whether you want to think about it in evolutionary terms or intelligent design terms or aliens coming down and programming us, however you want to think about it is fine. But I think at some point, people started developing these psychological types over time through evolution, intelligent design, whatever. And my argument is that it was I'm just going to keep talking about it in evolution terms because that's how I think about it. It was evolved to fix an issue with culture or to preserve culture in various cultures around the world. And you have to keep in mind through all of this that, as we were evolving as a species, there was no technology, right? The only technology we had was our brains, and then whatever we could make, with our brains. And so there was very little technology that we could rely on. And so a lot of things that the psychological types solved, a lot of the problems that psychological types solved, is now solved through different kinds of technology, right? So it doesn't seem as salient, it doesn't seem as important. It's just sort of this byproduct of how we evolved as a species, and maybe it's not as relevant anymore or as necessary anymore, but it's still there, right? And we still have to sort of deal with it or learn how to work with it. Okay, so you have 16 different types. And I would say the 60 different types played a different role in the various cultures where they emerged. Okay. And again, you might be thinking, well, why not just have everybody develop the same way? Well, nature and evolution, it's sort of trade-offs. It's, you have to preserve energy, you have to preserve resources. If you made everybody an INTJ, you're going to be trading off things that INTJs might not be as good or proficient at. And you just sort of tip the balance too far in one way, and you're going to miss out on other things that the other types are necessary for when sort of establishing and protecting a culture and keeping it running. And you have to think of a culture as its own thing, right? It's its own thing that has its own need for sustaining itself and protecting itself. And the different types play different roles in sustaining and protecting culture. Okay, so let me start with an example, and just to illustrate it, and also sort of tie it to how sort of your dominant and your auxiliary function are basically dictating what role you play in this sort of cultural structure. Okay, so let's just start with the INFJ. So the INFJ's got, the lead intuition, introverted intuition, and extroverted feeling. And so if you think of dominant introverted intuition as being sort of the fundamental role that the INFJ plays in culture, their role is to be basically a reservoir of knowledge, of intuitive knowledge. Okay. Because cultures needed to sustain their knowledge throughout generations, right? In order to sort of sustain the culture in and of itself, and to also sort of protect it from outsiders. And excuse me. And so the fundamental thing that the INFJ is doing is basically serving as the cultural library, right? And again, this was before there was writing, and people couldn't just write things down. They had to pass knowledge from one person down to the next, from one generation down to the next generation. And you needed some types of people who could store that knowledge, be sort of the reserve or the reservoir, the library, or the database, or however you want to think about it, of that knowledge. Okay. And there are basically two types of knowledge that needed to be handed down. You had your knowledge about your culture and your society. That's what the INFJs were sort of doing, right? Or responsible for. And then just sort of general knowledge about how things work, like, whatever limited technology you had, the way that the stars and the planets and all that worked. And that was probably more in the INTJ realm. And we'll get back to them. But what the INFJs were doing was storing knowledge about the culture. And here's a good example. In ancient Ireland, you had what you call the Brehons. And they were sort of a class of people within the ancient Irish culture. We sort of think of them as druids. Sort of the high priests of ancient Ireland, but they weren't priests in sort of the religious sense that we normally think of. They were the protectors of the culture. And so they were more thought of as like lawyers and judges. And they, and you had what you called this, the Brehon laws. That's B with a B as in boy, REHON, for those of you who feel like looking into this. And it was an oral tradition of laws that passed, from one generation to the next, but there were dedicated individuals within that society that were responsible for being sort of the reservoir of that knowledge and passing it along, right? And they would take young kids and train them to be Brehons, and they were trained in law, they were trained in poetry, they were trained in writing and language. Um, and the reason they would train them in poetry is because it's easier to remember things if it comes in the form of a poem, right? If it rhymes and it has a certain meter to it, it's just easier to remember. And so they would pass along this knowledge about what the laws of the culture were, right? If you murder my wife, how many cows do you have to pay me to make up for the fact that you murdered my wife? It was that kind of transactional thing. And so they were just, and it was, and there were principles to it, but they were also very specific laws, right? Like if you murder somebody, then it was a restitution society. They didn't just come and burn your house down. They would come and say, okay, well, you murdered my son or my kinsman, so you owe me money. And money back then was like cows and livestock and stuff like that. And so there's a whole system of this that evolved over time to basically give their culture sort of a sense of fairness and cohesion, right? So you didn't have people just burning each other's houses down all the time. And as you can imagine, there's lots of ways that people interact. There's lots of ways in which people can sort of, um, damage somebody else or sort of violate their rights or whatever. And so there's going to be a lot of laws that have to sort of be passed down. Okay. And the Brehons were responsible for that. And then if there was actually like a case, like somebody argued that somebody owed him money or he was responsible for his kid's death or whatever, they would go out and they'd hire one of these Brehons and they would just sort of like a court case, just sort each side would sort of present their case. And then the Brehon would, sort of make a judgment and decide, how the facts play out and, who harmed who, that kind of thing, and what the restitution was. And the Brehons, the judges, their reputation was based off of how good of a judgment they could make, right? So it was very important. Like they got paid based off of like the fairness of their judgment, and if they were shown to give a wrong judgment, then the judge had to pay the defendant or the plaintiff or whoever that they ruled against. They'd have to pay them some sort of restitution. So it was this very, very complicated system that was predicated on hundreds and hundreds of years of tradition. And they didn't write it down until like St. Patrick came around. Then they started writing it down, but then it got all confused because St. Patrick started putting all this Catholic stuff into it because he's St. Patrick, right? And so the old traditional Brehon laws had to be passed down through oral tradition, one person to the next, right? And so so it makes sense that if that's the way your culture works, you would at least want a handful of people who are adept and capable and just sort of programmed to be that type of person, that sort of reservoir of social knowledge and social norms. Okay. And that's the INFJ. And that's, I think, why, we sort of have this archetype of the INFJ as sort of being the wizard, and, druids are sort of thought of as being these wizardly types. But really, the essence is, it's really just sort of the wise old man, the wisdom of the elders, right? They're just sort of storing that tradition. And you see it in other cultures with, priests and shaman and stuff like that, who are just the reservoir of knowledge and, your society's rules. So what makes the INFJ so special in that is, so first they have the dominant introverted intuition. So they could just, that is what INFJs are built to do, is to just know things, right? If you had to program different people and different personality types within a culture, you need some sort of data storage base, right? And that's what, the INFJs, one of their roles was. And the reason that it's tied to sort of the culture and the social norms, or why INFJs sort of work well with that, is because of the extroverted feeling part, which, as or as I argue, is all about social engagement, engaging with other people, right? And I usually talk about it as just sort of navigating a social problem and trying to smooth things over, fix things, make sure things are sort of on the up and up. And that's part of FE, right? And that's sort of, what the day-to-day sort of FE uses. But in this sort of reservoir of knowledge system, you need FE to engage with other people, right? And if you have an oral tradition that's being handed down from one person to another, and it's about social structure, it's about the way people are supposed to interact with each other in your culture, in your society, FE is going to be fine-tuned into that, right? And it's going to serve as this interfacing function of learning from the elders, and also being able to apply it in sort of social situations, and then just build up that knowledge through this engagement, right, with people, and just learning. Okay, so we'll get back to the INFJ, but I hope that sort of resonates and makes sense to you, right? So the INFJs are just walking around being this reservoir of knowledge about social dynamics, about the way that the social system is supposed to work, and that's the FE part of it. Okay, and then the other point that I want to make is your dominant function is basically the point, like the point of whatever function role you're serving in your culture, and that it's the ends that you're trying to achieve, right? I'm like, if you're an INFJ, like the end is the knowledge, right? Like that's the whole point. It's not a means to the end, it is the actual end. You have been chosen, so to speak, to be the database for this culture, because we're going to need you to know it and understand it and be able to relay it to the next generation or whatever, right? um and the FE part, the auxiliary function, is sort of your means to that end. Like, how do you store that knowledge? How do you acquire that knowledge? How do you develop an understanding of that knowledge? How do you do what you're supposed to do, right? And you do it through your FE by engaging with people, okay? And engaging and sort of understanding the way that people engage with each other, and just understanding social dynamics. And that is your means to the end, okay? And that would be very different than something like an ENFJ, where their dominant function is the extroverted feeling and their secondary function is introverted intuition. They are not intended to be the reservoir of knowledge. The INFJs are the reservoir of knowledge. The ENFJs, their dominant function is to engage in social dynamics, right? Like to be the leaders, to be the people that sort of move the herd along, or whatever needs to be done in the social culture. But their means to their end is that introverted intuition, right? So they're relying on some sort of database of knowledge, but that's their means to the end, right? So their means is the introverted intuition. Their end is to engage with people in social dynamics and just sort of keep social systems running. Okay, but the database that they use for that is the introverted intuition. But that's the flip of the INFJ. The INFJ, the point, their end, is to be the reservoir of knowledge and to pass that knowledge along. And the means to the end is by interacting and observing how social dynamics work. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. One way I sort of think about the dominant function is sort of this old adage in artificial intelligence. It's an old story, short story. I think it might have been Isaac Asimov that came up with it, but I could be wrong. And it's the idea of the universal staple maker, where somebody designs a machine where its sole point is to make staples and to make as many staples as possible, right? And it's this robot program to make staples. But the robot becomes so super intelligent and its only goal is to make staples. And so it starts enslaving people to just make staples. And like, you can't make cars, you can't make anything else other than, staples. And then it realizes that it's better off, it can make the staples on its own if it just killed off all the humans. So it kills off all the humans so that it can make staples after staples after staples, right? And so it's this cautionary tale about artificial intelligence and alignment and, keeping it aligned with, social needs, right? And humanity. And I kind of think of the dominant function as being that, like, if just left to your own devices, you would just, if you're an INFJ, like, you would just want to soak up as much knowledge, as much knowledge, as much knowledge as possible. And we are perfectly content, just acquiring knowledge for knowledge's sake, right? Um, because again, I would argue we're just programmed to do that, right? We're programmed to walk into a bookstore and be like, wow, I'm going to read as many of these books as I possibly can. Now, of course, we never do, because we're moving from subject to subject, but we are just these sort of informavores, right? Like, we're just constantly eating information. And a lot of times we don't even know why we're doing it, right? Like, we want to tell ourselves, oh, I'm going to use this because I'm going to teach a class on it someday, or I'm going to create a YouTube channel, or, I'm going to do something with it, right? Because there's this drive to do something with it, that, fourth SE, aspirational sort of function, right? Like, you have all this knowledge, now you want to do something. So that's why you see so many INFJs building YouTube sites and, just wanting to get their information out there, writing blogs, that kind of stuff, because you spend this lifetime just sort of acquiring as much information as you can. And you don't know why you're doing it. You just do it, right? You're just the universal paperclip maker or staple maker. And you're just running and running and running and, and trying to acquire as much knowledge as possible. Okay. And you're doing it through this FE mechanism. And so the FE is sort of, again, it's your means to the end, where you engage with people. So when you engage with people, that is what you're trying to do, is acquire knowledge. And that's why, if you're an INFJ and you're talking to somebody who just frankly doesn't have a whole lot to, to say, or, nothing really all that, interesting, or it's not new ideas, you don't feel like you're getting any new knowledge out of them, you get bored real quickly, right? But you meet somebody who's, got all these crazy ideas, real smart, and interesting perspectives on things, and you just eat it up, right? Like, you engage with that person to acquire the knowledge. Okay. I'm going to get back to the INFJ. I don't want to get detracted from sort of the general point that I'm starting with, and that's the cultural assignment, right? Of these different personality types, right? Okay. So outside of the social domain, you also, if you're a society or a culture and you want to sustain yourself and you want to protect yourself from outside threats, you're also going to have to understand the physical world, not just the social world. Like, what are all the rules that we all have to follow to sort of get along? But the culture needs sort of a reservoir of knowledge of the outside object world. And probably the most important thing is, like, the seasons, right? Like, when is it going to get cold? When is it going to rain? When can we grow our food? When do we need to harvest it? How long do we need to store it, and how much? That kind of stuff. And that is all going to be tied to astronomy, and sort of following the patterns of the stars, right? So those are your INTJs, right? The INTJs figured all that stuff out, right? Like, how many months are in a season, how long is it going to be between seasons, that kind of stuff. How much food do we need to grow? And again, that's just like, they are the reservoir of that type of knowledge. Like, where are we in, our sort of our trip around the sun when you look at the stars, like how many more days do we have till whatever. And to me, that's why the INTJs are more like the Merlin kind of wizard, because he had that, like, that moon phase kind of knowledge about how things work, how systems work. But so they're that reservoir of knowledge, and so they're not acquiring their knowledge through social interaction and social engagement. They're acquiring their knowledge by engaging in doing measurements out in the world, like where are we in our trip around the sun, where are the stars, how much food do we have to grow, that kind of stuff, that very systematic object-based sort of knowledge that they're interacting with objects and systems, planetary motions, that kind of stuff. But again, like their role in the culture is to be that reservoir of knowledge, because eventually they're going to die off, and so they need to be able to explain it to the next generation, right? But if you're an INTJ, it's probably the same. Right. And so again, it's it's not immediately in front of you, like you have to put it to, you have to piece the puzzle pieces together to sort of form a representation, right? So the brand judge is going to be, where he's never seen the facts or the cases where he has to apply the digital principles of the law to come with a real system that everybody can agree upon in their culture. And so that direct experience, you're learning abstract principles that you can apply to life situations. So you compare those to the ISFJs and INTJs, where again, their motivating reason for being is to be sort of a reservoir of knowledge in a very different way. It's not the abstract AI type of knowledge, it's the things knowledge, day-to-day logistics activities, right? And the ISFJ is SI type of information, and so they're going to be sort of the reservoir of day-to-day operational type of things, right? Not being abstract, planets and stars in the sky, but more about how do you build, a weapon, right? Or how do you cook a meal, or how do you make clothes, or how do you build a shield, or how do you build a car, or how do you build a wheel, or how do you start a fire, that's the ISTJ, ISFJ kind of stuff, right? This is how you deal with people, sort of day-to-day activities, here's how you take care of them, everybody fat and happy. Where the ISTJ is going to focus more on, how do you make the clothes? How do you, make the tents? How do you start the fire? That kind of stuff, the object oriented knowledge. Okay. So they're sort of your reservoir knowledge of that kind of stuff. And they're going to sort of step in when somebody needs to know how to make a wigwam or, how to start a fire. Your ISTJ is going to be right there. Right. But they learn, and again, they're learning through engagement, right? So their engagement with the world, either through FE or TE, is their means to their end. Their sort of role is to know how to do stuff, right? But the means to the end is, either interacting with objects or interacting with people. Okay. And of course, none of this is like black and white, there's overlap and all that kind of stuff. But you just want to think in broad evolutionary terms. Why would we divide people up this way? Okay. So, hopefully you get the point. I don't really want to belabor like each type. I mean, maybe I'll make a video that goes into each type, but so those are sort of the knowledge function people. Their role is to, be some sort of reservoir of knowledge, either big abstract things that need to be handed down from generation to generation, or just sort of day-to-day things like how do you do stuff. And but the introverted thinkers, so your INTPs, your ISTPs, right? So your introverted thinkers are your introverted feelers, your deliberation types. They're the people who have to make decisions on the fly, right? So something in the world has changed and we need to make a decision on how to react to that change, right? So the INTPs are, again, they didn't have calculators back then or abacuses or anything. And so they relied on the INTPs to do the calculation stuff, right? They're sort of the, pocket calculator that you'd bring out and say, okay, we had a fire and we lost, a certain number of barrels of grain or something. Like, how many do we need to generate to replace it? And, that kind of stuff, right? And it's real world decision making with problems that are happening in the real world, right? Or there's this town, across the river, and they're going to come attack us, and there's like 50 of them, and there's only 25 of us. Like, what do we do, right? Your INTPs are going to be sort of the ones that figure that out, if it's sort of new information. Your ISTPs as well, right? The ship broke. How do I fix it? Right. The INTJ, being that reservoir of knowledge, isn't necessarily going to know how to do these, these one-off things that have to be fixed in the here and now. Right. ISTPs are going to be able to do that. They're going to be able to fix whatever needs to be fixed in the here and now and figure it out. INTPs are going to sort of figure out maybe more abstract things like, a math problem that needs to be solved. Again, it's sort of the culture's calculator. I think of them, that they turn to when they need that kind of information. Okay. So you could see, and then with the introverted feelers, they're going to be making judgment calls in real time on social type situations, right? So the INFP might be more the better judge or the mediator, right? So I talk about the Brehens being sort of the INFJs being this reservoir of knowledge, but the INFP is probably going to step in and actually be, make the jump ball decision, right? Like, because that FI allows them to sort of prioritize things, like what's more important, not only to them, but to the culture. What's more important, given this situation? What's the more fair outcome? What's going to be better for society as a whole? And the INFPs are going to be really good at making those sort of game time decisions, right? So the INFJs had this sort of reservoir of knowledge of like, here's the general principles, here's what we sort of rely on, here are the sort of tried and here are the rules that we've all sort of agreed on. But every once in a while, you're going to have one of these one-off cases where somebody's got to make a decision, right? And they got to make a decision about what's going to be the most fair to the society or whatever, right? So INFPs are going to be really good at making those deliberative decisions, where the ISFPs, again, they're probably going to, the INFPs are going to probably focus more on the abstract stuff, like, legal decisions, sort of more abstract things on dealing with society, where the ISFJ or ISFP, sorry, they're good at the lead introverted feeling, but extroverted sensing in their second. And they might be more about, quite frankly, just sort of making sure that people are staying in line, socially. They're going to create some sort of social cohesion. They're probably going to be the ones who come up with, like, the insignia for the group, right? Or like the pattern that they put in their pottery, or their clothes, or whatever, their weapons, to sort of mark their group, to show that, everybody's in this group as opposed to some other group, right? And that's, an argument of where art came from, right? Is this idea of, being able to identify with the group. And so you have these sort of insignias and things like that. And I can imagine the ISFPs probably came up with all that stuff, right? That seems like a good role for them. And they're also going to sort of enforce sort of just making sure that everybody understands what their place is, in a way. Or, the fact that they're part of one group, right? That kind of stuff. I have to think about it a little bit more what the ISFP is doing, but it's kind of that. It's using like actual physical information or doing physical things in the world to create that sense of being within the group, kind of thing, creating the insignias, that kind of stuff. And also just like having sort of a individual sort of, appreciation for whether or not somebody's an insider or an outsider, right? The ISFPs are going to be the ones who figure out whether somebody's intruding, right? Like, they're going to be able to read the people and know, like, okay, are you part of my group? Or are you not? That kind of thing. Are you wearing our insignia? Or are you not? That kind of stuff. Okay. We'll figure out the ISFPs. They have a role. Okay. ESTJs, of course, they're just going to be running things. They're going to be like, here's the process. We're going out hunting. Here's how we do it. And again, the ISTJ is going to sort of know how to do it. And the ESTJ is going to sort of, again, they're engaging in the process, in the actual hunting, or the actual, warfare, or whatever, right? The extroverted thinking is the actual engagement, and so that is their role, right? That's their universal stapler maker, is that extroverted thinking, and they're using their SI as sort of the means to that end, right? Like, what knowledge can I rely on to do this stuff? Where the opposite is the ISTJ, where their role is to just know it and be available when the ESTJ needs to know how to do it, right? So I hope that makes sense. And that you can see how they all sort of rely on each other, all sort of, dependent on each other. And culture is basically just this big giant brain, right? This big giant computer that needs different people to serve different functions within that big giant computer. So again, if you had everybody just doing the same thing, then you would lose out on, very important aspects of your culture, right? And people would have to use too many resources to solve the problem, right? So it's better to just sort of divide up, in the same way, economics works, right? It's, what is that concept called? Where, one country's better at making wine and another country's better at making bread. And so you have the countries that can make the wine, the countries that make the bread. There's an economic term that I'm totally blanking on. that describes that phenomenon. And that's basically what's going on in culture. And personality types. Okay. So now hopefully you get the point that I'm trying to make. And again, I don't want to belabor it too much and go through all the types. But maybe I'll make another video sort of focusing on each type and their role. But the bigger thing I want to talk about is understanding if you are an INFJ or if you are interacting with an INFJ, understanding where the INFJ is coming from, and why INFJs might be a lot different when you're interacting with them than maybe your average person. And you can probably say that about all types. So again, you have to keep in mind that the INFJ is all about just acquiring knowledge. And it's going to do that through social interaction, social engagement, and social observation, right? So FE is sort of the lens, the funnel, the mechanism of interacting with the world. And through that interaction, we're building up our knowledge. And it could be as simple as just watching YouTube videos, right? Where you're just watching somebody like me talk about stuff and you're just building up that reservoir of knowledge and you feel perfectly content. Like you are in your flow state, just doing that, right? And it could be anything. It could be learning a language. It could be, learning MBTI. It could be learning psychology. It could be learning about NBA player stats, whatever. Usually it's somehow focused on a social type of thing, like, religion, culture, language, psychology, that kind of stuff. And you were just in your flow state when you're learning about that stuff. And so you can ask you, like, why are you learning about all this stuff? Like, I don't know, it's just the way my brain's programmed is to just soak up this information and learn as much as I can. And then hopefully at some point you'll have SE sort of kick in and you can engage and use that information in the outside world. But, a lot of times, you kind of need somebody to help you along, sort of kick you in the butt and, motivate you or even better, like instruct you to do it, right? So to get a job, you have to use your SE to do your day-to-day work. That's going to motivate you to use all that smarty pants knowledge that you're acquiring. So if you're an INFJ and you're, just, constantly finding yourself in the bookstore and sitting there for hours and hours, going from one section to the other, reading books, from computer technology to, a biography of Steve Jobs to some sort of fiction, classic fiction that you're always interested in. That's why. I mean, as soon as you walk into that bookstore, you walk into a library, your brain just goes, like just giving as much information. And I actually worked when I was in college. I worked at the library at college, and it at the time was literally the largest library in the world. And so I was just surrounded by like every book you could possibly imagine. And, you work during the summer, basically nothing's going on. You're just, putting the books away and you could just sit there and just read about whatever, right? And not only that, but like you start to have your choice of which books you want to put away. And every day I had like a different subject area that, like one day it might be psychology, another day it might be, jazz history or something, and I put those books away and then I spend the rest of the day just sort of reading, right? And that is just like the best job. Because you can just sit there and just read all day. And if you're dealing with, if you know an INFJ, if you live with an INFJ, that is essentially what they are sort of programmed to do. It's just learn. And you might just be like, well, why are you learning it? Like, why do you want to learn Irish? The language Irish. Why do you want to learn about the Roman Empire? All that kind of stuff. They have no like a border collie, right? Where they're programmed to, through genetics, they're just programmed to herd sheep and to work, to be worker dogs. And so if you have a border collie, you take them out on a walk, you have to give them a job to do, right? You have to have them carry the water or do something. They make these little, backpacks for them, because that's what makes them happy, right? They don't know why they're doing it. They're doing it because that's what they're genetically programmed to do. And it's the same thing with INFJs. Like, we don't know. We have no idea why we got, a bookshelf full of books that are like, half read. Like, we read it enough to get the point, and it's all over the place. Like, it's a million different subjects. Because that's just what we do, right? And we just think, like, well, someday this information will be useful for you. I don't know. Maybe somebody on YouTube will need to know it. I don't know. So then when you're interacting with them, and the other thing to understand, the other point I want to make about the INFJ is because we're using that FE-NI sort of combination, NI is a lot of times thought of as perspectives, right? There's another channel. Oh God, I forget. It's a husband and wife. It's been a while since I watched their channel. It's a pretty good channel, but it's kind of one of these self-help personality hacker. I think that's what it's called. It's a little bit more like self-helpy MBTI stuff, but I like them, and I think they have good things to say, and you can learn a lot from them. And they describe NI as perspectives, right? And so when we as INFJs are learning things, we are learning it from the other person's perspective, and that's really hard to articulate and explain. But when you argue, like when you argue with an INFJ, or you're just interacting with an INFJ, they don't argue from their point of view. Like, we don't argue like, I feel this and I feel, damaged or threatened because you're doing blah, 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 blah. That's not where we come from. We come from, like, we try to get inside your head, like one of those little mushrooms that gets inside of, the ants' heads and sort of, takes over their body. And like, we're trying to get into your mind and basically make you make the argument from your perspective, right? The way that I kind of think about it is, if I'm playing chess, I'm not thinking about what I'm trying to do to the other side. I'm thinking about what they're trying to do to me. Okay. And so it comes across as kind of defensive, I guess, in a way. But it's not defensive in the, like, you're hurting my feelings kind of thing. But it's defensive in the sense that, like, I am trying to control where you're going with your argument, or where you're going with what you're saying. And so I'm putting myself into your head and trying to make you think of it from my perspective or somebody else's perspective, whatever the case may be. And it's not a sense of, I'm just going to, like an SP might, where like it's just a war of attrition, and I'm just going to beat you down with, telling you how wrong you are, or how much you're hurting my feelings, or whatever, like, no, like, we are trying to get into the other person's head and control their narrative that way. Okay. And it's not about us, it's about them. And getting them to understand where we're coming from. And I would argue it's that FE-NI combination where we when our whole sort of programming is meant to absorb knowledge. And again, think of it in evolutionary Bronze Age kind of terms, where we have to acquire somebody else's knowledge so that we can store it and pass it along to the next generation. you can imagine that evolution or intelligent design or whatever is going to come up with a system to where we can place ourselves in their head, right? Metaphorically speaking, of course, right? Where we are reading it from their perspective. Okay, we're not reading it from our perspective. We're not reading it from what we're trying to get out of it. It's demonstrative FI. We are ignoring or disregarding that FI part, right? Like we don't care about how we feel about it. What we care about is their perspective and trying to put ourselves into their mind and how they are seeing it and how they understand the concept. And then we incorporate that into our own intuition. Okay. Very hard to articulate, very hard to describe. The INFJs and probably the INTJs are like, like they get it, and everybody else is like, huh. But think of the chess analogy, right? Where I am not trying to exert my will onto my opponent. I am trying to figure out what he's doing so that I can control the situation, right? And I don't know if that's a winning strategy or a losing strategy. It's probably a losing strategy at some point. You probably want to be a little bit more aggressive, but that's why INFJs are not aggressive. We're not trying to impose our will into the situation. What we're trying to do is frame the situation in a way we want it framed. And we're trying to get the person that we're interacting with, whether it's an argument or we're just having a conversation, like we are trying to absorb knowledge out of this person, and even in an argument, like we want to know where they're coming from, right? Because if we can understand where they're coming from, we might be able to put a seed into their head that look, you're coming at this from the wrong angle. You should be thinking about it this way or that way or this way or that way. But we're not like, oh my God, you're hurting my feelings. Or, that's just not fair. Or that's not the way it's done, or, any other sort of argument that other types might come up with, or even trying to tell them that they're irrational or irrational. Like we're perfectly willing to accept where they're coming from. We just want to control it, right? We want to sort of push it in one direction as opposed to the direction that they're going in, right? And so INFJs, as opposed, in addition to being a reservoir of knowledge, if you're an INFJ and you're trying to figure out, okay, like what should I do? Like, what would I be good at? INFJs are great negotiators, just great negotiators, whether it's, being a lawyer or a business person, or even, law enforcement, anything where being able to put yourself in the other person's perspective is, beneficial, and not taking into account what you're trying to get out of the situation. Like you really are trying to understand what the other person is saying and what their representation of it is. Now, sometimes you can come out as being a little bit of a pushover because we could be a little too accommodating, or we could be like, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. Okay. And so, sometimes to be like a hardcore, hard-nosed negotiator, you need to have a little bit more SE and exert your will into the situation. But, if you're in sort of a line of business where it's not hardcore negotiation, it's basically like everybody's just trying to get the job done. We're just trying to find a reasonable solution to a reasonable problem. INFJs do great in that kind of negotiation. Again, and I've mentioned this before, but there's this CIA agent that's on a bunch of podcasts or he's a former agent, and he talks, and somebody asked him the question, what makes a CIA agent a good CIA agent? In this case, probably an INFJ. I get the sense that he is. And his answer was, being able to see, when you're talking to a quote unquote asset, or, somebody you're interrogating, or whatever, you're talking to somebody as a CIA agent, to be able to see it from their perspective, right? To understand where they're coming from and what they're trying to get out of the situation, and not what you're trying to get out of the situation. That's a very INFJ answer. And maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but it's what helped him, you know. So, you know, if you're an INFJ, maybe go out and be a CIA agent. That might be a good thing for you as well. Cybersecurity, you know, understanding, I mean, that's probably more of an INTJ thing, like understanding the perspective of somebody using technology against you, that kind of thing. But you know, hopefully you get my point. And the bigger point being that when you're thinking of the personality types, you have to think about, number one, what is their universal staple maker? Like, you know, if you just shut off all the other functions and you just let them run, you know, without any sort of constraints, right? They had enough food, they had enough money, all that kind of stuff. What would they do? And, you know, and then looking at the secondary function of figuring out, okay, how do they do what they do, right? So again, if you're an INFJ, left to your own devices, your primary function, dominant function, you're just going to go out and try to absorb as much knowledge as possible. Why? I don't know. Because maybe someday it's going to be useful, right? And come up with as many theories and, you know, takes on the world as possible. And you're going to do that through social interaction. And social interaction doesn't necessarily mean just talking to people one-on-one. It's also sort of observing, you know, like we can sit in a bar and just people watch, right? And you're observing the dynamics of the people. And again, I think that's an FE-NI combination thing where you're observing, soaking in the information, watching the social dynamics unfold. And that is just building up knowledge in your head. And so that's why an INFJ can just sit there for hours and people watch, you know, because it's just a constant stream of information that, you know, we find entertaining, right? Or informative or whatever, right? And so it doesn't necessarily have to be you personally engaging, you know, or it could be watching documentaries, watching movies, just watching people socially engage and talk about this kind of stuff. Okay, so I think that's about it. I'm probably gonna do some other videos today, so you know, stick around if you're out there. Would be interested in hearing your thoughts. I'm sure I'm gonna have more to say on this perspective thing because it's very hard to articulate. So I got to start to think it through and try to come up with some more analogies or hypotheticals, you know. But let me know if you've got any. And if for the INFJs out there, if this sort of resonates and makes sense to you. Okay, cool. Talk to you later. Bye.